Palworld, aka Pokemon with Guns, the Rust-like game with Pokemon in them with some Zelda Breath of the Wild style exploration that has taken the world by a storm. Since last time we talked about it, the review score has only gone up from 93 to 94%, and this is from 102,000 reviews, over 102,000 user reviews. The game is still in early access, and it's already seeing an incredible amount of success that nobody anticipated. The game is being sold at $30 in this early access stage. It was a little cheaper a while back while it was discounted. And seeing the progression of the game's sales has been insane. And this is just on Steam. The game's also out on Xbox. We don't know what those sales numbers look like, but I imagine that if you combine those with the Steam numbers, the sales figures are probably higher than we think they are. But in terms of Steam alone, it sold 1 million copies in only 8 hours. It then sold 2 million in 24 hours, 3 million in 40 hours, 4 million in 3 days, 5 million in 3 days, 6 million in 4 days, 7 million in 5 days, and the latest sales figure is that it sold 8 million in 6 days. And referring to the 7 millions figure in particular, Jeff Keighley noted that this translates to approximately 189 million US dollars in Steam sales in 5 days. That number's only gone higher now that we know it sold 8 million units in 6 days. And I imagine that that figure is rapidly approaching, 10 million. And then seeing the progression of peak concurrent players on Steam has been just as insane as seeing the sales figures rapidly rise. Look at the all-time peak concurrent players for this game. Over 2 million players tuned in at one point. So looking at the chart here, you can see that the game peaked at 800,000, then over 1 million, 1,200,000, then 1,500,000, then 1,800,000, and then 2 million. And it is still doing incredible numbers. I mean, just 9 hours ago, almost 2 million people tuned in. The player retention of this game is just insane. Quite a sight to behold. And this places Palworld now at number 2 when it comes to the most peak concurrent players we have seen on Steam, beating out even Counter-Strike 2, which peaked at 1.8 million. Palworld beat it out at 2 million. It's still got some ways to go before it beats PUBG's 3.2 million peak concurrent players that it achieved at one point. I don't know if it'll quite get that far, but who knows with Palworld being as successful as it is now. Maybe once the game does launch, those peak concurrent player numbers will rise to new heights. Again, it's just an early access. But yeah, even on SteamDB, you can see right here that the game has been confirmed to have peaked at over 2 million concurrent players. Like, I knew that on some level this game would garner a lot of traction because it's a meme game of sorts. It's Pokemon with guns. But when the meme game actually turns out to be really good and really addicting and something that players are having a really good time with, it transcends the meme and it becomes just a meteoric rise of a success. And the Palworld developers are very well aware of this game's success and the need to keep churning out updates and additional content, which is why the developers have come out to detail the roadmap of this game that aims to address critical issues as well as implement new features like PvP, raid bosses, Pal Arena, Steam Xbox crossplay, various Xbox feature improvements, server transfers and migrations, improvements to the building system, new islands, pals, bosses, and technologies. So there is seemingly a long and successful road ahead for this game, assuming legal troubles don't get in the way. I've touched upon this extensively in my last video, but basically for those who don't know, the game is being accused of using AI and or plagiarizing Pokemon. Now, the accusation that it's using AI, there's no grounds for that. It's speculation, and I've not seen any evidence yet that the game has used AI, so that's a conversation that I'm not going to have in this video. When it comes to the plagiarism stuff, it depends on who you ask. A lot of people are posting comparison screenshots of Pals versus Pokemon and how it does take elements from Pokemon, whether it's different pieces of Pokemon that have been fused into one, to stuff that very much just straight up resembles the original Pokemon. I did remember seeing this Pal in the game and thinking this very much reminds me of the Pokemon that it is inspired from. Some of this stuff definitely does feel kind of blatant in its inspiration, though whether it can be categorized as plagiarism, I suppose the courts will determine if Nintendo decides to take this to court. But yeah, plenty of posts and threads detailing the similarities between Pals and Pokemon, and plenty of people chiming in for or against the stance that some of this stuff may or may not constitute plagiarism. But for certain designs here, the similarities are definitely undeniable. Here's one more user who put together this giant collage that compares and contrasts PALs and Pokemon. And I do think some of the comparisons are reaching, but some I can see why they're being brought up. And there are plenty of discussions surrounding, what constitutes inspiration versus plagiarism. There are those bringing up the fact that Pokemon took inspiration from certain Dragon Quest designs, but then there are others arguing that you can tell the difference between the Dragon Quest and Pokemon designs, whereas in Palworld, there are certain PALs that so closely resemble the Pokemon, they could potentially confuse a PAL for something that maybe came from Pokemon. I don't know, man. This discussion is still raging on. But one of the strongest cases that could be made for the accusation that Palworld is plagiarizing Pokemon is if it turns out to be true that the models for PALs are essentially ripped from Pokemon and then changed a little bit, like someone who takes somebody else's homework and changes it a little bit to make it seem like it was their own work. If that is indeed what has happened, and if the accusations surrounding that are true, then Nintendo might have a case. But yeah, plenty of people have pointed this out, that the similarities are striking enough that it's almost impossible that happened by coincidence, is what even like professional developers and 3D modelers are saying. Now, one of the individuals who's been putting out alleged evidence that Palworld models are very reminiscent of Pokemon models to the point where they feel like ripped off models, like assets taken directly from Pokemon, is this Twitter user Biofrog, who put out footage like these right here and who made this comparison. But this individual now coming out and saying things like, I'm doing this because I think it's disgusting how much Palworld glorifies animal abuse, has given the impression that maybe he's faked some stuff and that the only reason he's doing this and he's trying to essentially stain Palworld's reputation is because this individual might have some sort of agenda. But you do have other individuals chiming in, like Gogo here, who is a technical animator in the games industry, who did their own tests and have discovered that certain similarities are so striking that it'd be one hell of a coincidence if Palworld did not directly rip off Pokemon models and then adjusted them. Gogo even went as far as publishing a video on YouTube that's 10 minutes long that explains in detail why the similarities between certain Palworld models and Pokemon models are disconcerting and why it might hint at potential copyright infringement or plagiarism of Pokemon work. And then somebody else who chimed in is this junior environment artist who responded to Gogo by theorizing that this might explain why this Pokemon mod that replaced Palworld models with Pokemon could come out so quickly, stating if the rigs are all the same, it's just a matter of changing models. That would explain how quickly this Pokemon mod was done. Now, there are those who are chiming in saying that they're not fully convinced that Pokemon models were directly ripped from. This individual, for example, highlights how the topology of triangles is different in this particular example, but they also say that the last time they touched 3D software was a decade ago. And so this individual got responses like this one from someone who is a freelance animator who pointed out the fact that they hadn't touched 3D software for like a decade and times have changed on that front. And apparently nowadays read topology is damn easy, making it possible to rip models and change it just enough to make it look different, but the similarities are still there enough where you can tell that maybe the models were directly ripped from the source material, in this case Pokemon. Here's somebody else who is a 2D illustrator and 3D artist chiming in that 3D modeling software usually has a retopologize option and details a potential example of a process through which Palworld could have ripped Pokemon models, saying that my guess is that they imported the model, reduced mesh, and topologized with a number of faces close enough where it would work better in the engine, kind of like reducing assets from high poly to lower poly for performance. Now look, I myself am not an expert in 3D modeling and animating and rigging and whatnot, so I'm not here to tell you one way or the other that plagiarism happened for sure or plagiarism didn't happen. I'm just presenting you what the discussion is right now and what different sides of the fence are saying, what professionals are saying on multiple fronts. Again, a proper investigation likely has to be conducted to fully determine if full-on plagiarism took place. As for what Nintendo has been saying or how they've been responding or what activity on Nintendo's front has been like, well, there are a couple things that have happened. The first thing is, as I mentioned before, somebody has already made a Pokemon mod for Palworld, as detailed here by IGN on January 22nd, 2024. This modder Toasted Shoes apparently created DreamWorks and Pixar mods and is now back with a Palworld mod that replaces the creatures inhabiting the world into actual Pokemon and adds a playable Ash Ketchum. It shouldn't come as a surprise that Nintendo very quickly came after this, given how blatantly this takes somebody else's IP and rips it off. And I do believe that Toasted was profiting off of this mod by putting the mod up on Patreon, which makes this a much more clear-cut case. Toasted right here tweeted, "Nintendo has come for me. Please leave me in your thoughts and prayers," showing a screenshot of him tweeting the trailer for the Pokemon mod that has since been disabled and taken down due to copyright by the copyright owner, aka Nintendo and the Pokemon Company. And this is something that made enough waves that the Palworld modding community are steering clear of any Pokemon mods. So right here we have a report from Games Radar that reported on a statement that was posted on Discord this morning by the Palworld mod subreddit that reads, "Hey y'all, I'm sure many of you have been seeing all of the content regarding the Pokemon mod for Palworld. While the memes and such are hilarious, the mod alone hosts a giant risk to the community and will need to take precautions so that Nintendo's lawyers don't nuke all of us with litigious actions. The mod is highly likely using ripped assets and is very illegal in Nintendo's eyes." Yeah, that's probably the smartest thing to do. It's just not worth the risk when we're talking about Nintendo. Next up, we got a response from a former Pokemon Company employee, more specifically Don McGowan, who once upon a time headed the Pokemon Company's legal team for 12 years from 2008 to 2020. Given the specific role he had at the Pokemon Company for 12 years at that, his input likely is of some value, and here's what he had to say when he was asked by Stephen Totillo by news outlet GameFile about the Palworld situation. Don said, "This looks like the usual rip-off nonsense that I would see 1,000 times a year when I was chief legal officer of Pokemon. I'm just surprised it got this far." The former chief legal officer of Pokemon is basically saying that I can't believe that Nintendo and the Pokemon Company haven't taken legal action at this point. But alas, Don McGowan no longer knows what's going on at Nintendo since he's not employed at Nintendo anymore, since he's no longer chief legal officer for Pokemon. So let's hear directly from Nintendo and the Pokemon Company, who put out a statement on January 25th, 2024, which reads as follows. "Inquiries regarding other companies' games. We have received many inquiries regarding another company's game released in January 2024, Palworld, which they don't name directly. We have not granted any permission for the use of Pokemon intellectual property or assets in that game. We intend to investigate and take appropriate measures to address any acts that infringe on intellectual property rights related to Pokemon. We will continue to cherish and nurture each and every Pokemon and its world and work to bring the world together through Pokemon in the future." Signed, the Pokemon Company. Now, do keep in mind that this is no guarantee that legal action will be taken, but it is them putting out there that they are going to initiate an investigation of sorts to see if there is any sort of infringement, to see if there's any cause within Palworld for Nintendo to pursue legal action. Now, some like Daniel Ahmad here have interpreted Nintendo and the Pokemon Company statement as basically along the lines of, "Please stop sending us emails about Palworld." It's being interpreted as a statement that Nintendo and the Pokemon Company put out there because they've been getting so many messages and inquiries from the gaming community and from media outlets surrounding this whole situation that this is them saying, "Hey, we're confirming that we know about this. We'll let you know more when we have an update," essentially. This is them confirming that they are being proactive about this, but it's not confirmation that they're perceiving Palworld as a product that has infringed on their property. Though time will tell. You know, if we hear nothing from them months and years down the line, then it's likely that Nintendo and the Pokemon Company have decided to drop this whole situation and not pursue anything. Though they may be in the phase of just really making sure that they have their ducks in order before they fully pursue legal action. Now, some are saying that it's interesting how Nintendo went after the Pokemon mod so quickly, and yet Palworld still hasn't seen any sort of legal action, potentially suggesting that Nintendo isn't seeing, suing Palworld as some kind of high priority, or that they're not seeing a case being made for Palworld being copyright infringement, to which I'd say that the mod is such a significantly more clear-cut case that Nintendo doesn't really have to do any legwork to prove that this is copyright infringement. Whereas with Palworld, I'd say you do have to look into it a bit more. You do have to compare all the different Palworld designs and compare them to Pokemon. And then when it comes to more serious accusations, like 3D models from Pokemon being taken, changed a little bit, and then being implemented in Palworld, that is also going to take investigation. That's not as clear cut, even amongst the game development community, amongst 3D artists and stuff like that. There are arguments being made on both sides, and it's a matter of having to dig through the game and its files and having to make the proper comparisons. With Palworld in particular, if there is a ripping off situation going on, it'd be nowhere near as blatant and as obvious as what the modder did here, where they literally put Ash Ketchum in the game and the exact Pokemon designs from the Pokemon IP. And so I think it makes sense that it take more time for Nintendo to pursue legal action against Palworld, and that's even assuming that Nintendo has such intent. Now, if Nintendo were to pursue legal action, what would happen? Well, this was a question that IGN asked to lawyers, specifically to Peter Lewin, video game lawyer at Wigan, and Sam Castry, a copyright lawyer and avid Pokemon player. They were asked about scenarios that could play out if Nintendo were to pursue legal action, if that is their intention at all. And here's what they had to say. Ideas generally aren't protected by copyright, but the particular expression of an idea can be. One company can't stop another from making a game about catching and battling monsters, but if a company copies important aspects of how exactly another company expresses that game concept, say characters, story beats, names, etc., that's where issues can arise. In this instance, the main focus seems to be on the PAL designs and 3D models rather than the game concept as a whole. Indeed, when you play Palworld, it's immediately apparent that it plays very differently from Pokemon. Again, Palworld is more like Rust rather than Pokemon. It's not Pokemon with guns, it's Rust that happens to have Pokemon in them. So from that standpoint, it's definitely nowhere close the same game. But the Pokemon models and the fact that certain 3D models from Palworld align so well with certain Pokemon 3D models, that might be where Nintendo might be able to pursue a case. That's where plagiarism could potentially be alleged. In the case of similarities between 3D models, here's what lawyers had to say. It's not enough to have a fire elemental dragon in the game. That dragon would need to closely mimic, say, Charizard's design or be described with an amalgamation of the various Pokedex entries or something like that, which is kind of what we're seeing Palworld be accused of. Plenty of people highlighting how certain pals basically take elements from different Pokemon and combine them into one, how certain elements seem to be copied directly enough where you could potentially confuse a pal for a Pokemon, so on and so forth. Again, currently, it's going to be a matter of each individual's opinion, but I think the similarities are enough where cases could be made. I can see why some people are bringing this up and why this is a discussion at all. Now, let's say hypothetically that Nintendo were to pursue legal action against Pocket Pair, the developers of Palworld. What kinds of scenarios could play out? Well, Pocket Pair could choose to update Palworld and alter or cut out the pals that are seen as problematic. They could choose to negotiate with Nintendo for some kind of settlement or licensing agreement, or they could choose to full-on fight the lawsuit. Now, taking the situation fully to court would mean that Pocket Pair may have to disclose, say, internal communications and emails that might end up proving that copyright infringement or plagiarism has occurred. So if it turns out that Pocket Pair is guilty, they'd want to likely keep this whole situation on the down low. Naturally, says this lawyer, if internal documents exist which suggest that intentional copying has occurred, knowing these might be revealed during the process may encourage a party to try and find an early and more discreet resolution. And then on Nintendo's side of things, if they fully take things to court and things don't end up going their way, then it's possible that a judge decides that there's no infringement, and that may create a blueprint for other companies to follow. If this doesn't go Nintendo's way, it might set a bad precedent. It might actually end up being a self-owned, not just for Nintendo, but for other companies moving forward as well. One of the lawyers, Castry, also added that it can pay to bide one's time in an effort to protect the longer-term legal position, and also there are non-legal issues to consider, like a potential public relations uproar. Here's the thing about Palworld that keeps it more protected. It is very beloved right now. People are really enjoying this game. I myself, and that's one of the protections that Palworld has right now, is that it's been so positively received as a game. People are having such a good time with it that if Nintendo were to somehow take down Palworld, it would create a mass uproar. It would piss off a lot of people. And there's little doubt that that's an aspect that any company would consider. Is it worth pursuing legal action and taking the potential PR damage that could come from that due to the fact that what we're taking down is so popular and so beloved? Now, from then on, hypothetically, what would happen if Nintendo ends up winning a case against Pocket Pair and Palworld? Well, they might demand money damages, and that'd be a lot of money because Palworld performs so well commercially, or there could be a court order that blocks Pocket Pair from selling the game. Now, again, all of this is theoretical. This is assuming things even get this far, which seems unlikely, I feel. but who knows? Now, as for how likely it is that Nintendo will actually end up suing Pocket Pair and Palworld, Castry believes that it is not a high likelihood because a lot of the alleged similarities are too trivial to withstand serious scrutiny, though he noted that there are certain specific pals whose designs are so close to the Pokemon that they were clearly inspired from, so blatant that might potentially open the road for potential court proceedings. Nintendo actually issuing a lawsuit is not wholly impossible, stating that there are some that are really blatant. Eevee's head on a fluffy cloud-like body, one that I outright mistook for Leafeon in some pictures, another that looks an awful lot like Lucario. Even if it's just a handful of pals that legitimately infringe on Pokemon copyrights, that's still copyright infringement. Those few pals that might potentially be deemed as blatantly copying Nintendo could be used by Nintendo to issue a preliminary injunction to temporarily block sales, though at the same time, because it's just a handful of pals that might be copying Pokemon while the rest of the game is original enough, a judge may be hesitant to bar sales of Palworld over a handful of infringing pals, or as the lawyer put it here, it might be a hard sell to the wrong judge, but if a court does issue a preliminary injunction, then Pocket Pair will almost certainly settle very quickly. At that point, they would want to minimize their own losses as fast as possible. Again, this is all fully theoretical and hypothetical. This is how things could potentially play out depending on how far Nintendo wants to push this, and the spectrum is basically the best case scenario for Palworld would be Nintendo decides this is just not worth taking to court or claiming plagiarism, and then on the worst end of the spectrum, it'd be that Palworld turns out it does infringe copyright, it does copy some things enough where Nintendo can do quite a bit of damage, whether it's stopping sales temporarily or forcing some kind of restitution in terms of payment and whatnot. But only time will tell ultimately how this will play out and how far Nintendo plans to take this. All we have right now is an official statement of the Pokemon Company saying we're investigating, but nothing in terms of the kinds of actions they may or may not take. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is everything you need to know about the latest surrounding Palworld, from its continued meteoric rise to potential legal troubles it might see depending on how Nintendo feels about Palworld. Let me know in the comments below how you think this will all end up playing out, and if you've played Palworld, is it a game that you're enjoying? And then when it comes to topics like plagiarism, how do you feel about it? Do you feel like Palworld on some level plagiarizes certain aspects of Pokemon, or do you feel like Palworld is ultimately in the clear when it comes to that accusation? Share all of your thoughts in the comments below, and to be further updated on all things gaming news, reviews, and discussions, stay tuned right here on Young Yeah. I'll see you guys next time. Young out.